What happens when one of Hollywood's most unpredictable legends sits down with a host who refuses to back down? What happens when charm meets confrontation? When old-school Hollywood collides with modern media expectations? And when a simple interview spirals into one of the most uncomfortable moments in daytime television history? Before we get into this absolute train wreck of an interview, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me whose side you're on in this clash. Because trust me, you're going to have opinions. Now let's dive into what went down when Jack Nicholson walked onto The View. Set, and everything fell apart. The studio lights were blazing hot that morning, the kind of heat that makes everyone just a little more irritable than usual. Jack Nicholson strolled onto the stage with that signature grin, the one that's made him millions and terrified directors for decades. He was wearing his trademark sunglasses, despite being indoors, a purple silk shirt that probably cost more than most people's rent, and an attitude that said he'd rather be literally anywhere else. The audience erupted in applause because this was Jack Nicholson, the man who gave us the Joker before anyone knew what a comic book movie could be, the man who made us afraid to stay in hotel rooms, the man who could make 3 words, "Here's Johnny," become part of the cultural lexicon forever. Savannah Guthrie was filling in as guest host that day, and she sat at the table with her notes perfectly organized, her questions carefully prepared, her game face firmly in place. The other hosts were there too, smiling, welcoming, ready for what they thought would be a fun, light-hearted conversation with a Hollywood icon. They had no idea what was coming. None of them did. Jack settled into his chair with the casual confidence of someone who had done 1,000 interviews and could do 1,000 more in his sleep. He adjusted his sunglasses, leaned back, and waited. Savannah started with the usual pleasantries, thanking him for coming, mentioning his incredible career, touching on his latest project. Jack nodded along, giving short answers, clearly not interested in the softball questions. Then Savannah shifted gears. "So, Jack, you've been in this industry for over 5 decades now," Savannah began, her tone friendly but with an edge that suggested she wasn't going to let this be just another promotional interview. "You've worked with some of the greatest directors. You've won multiple Oscars. You're considered one of the finest actors of your generation. But there's been some criticism lately about some of your past comments regarding women in Hollywood. Comments about the way things used to be on sets back in the 70s and 80s. Do you stand by those comments? Or do you think maybe it's time to acknowledge that those attitudes were part of a bigger problem?" The smile on Jack's face didn't change, but something in his posture did. He tilted his head slightly, the way a predator might when sizing up whether something is a threat or just annoying. "Which comments specifically are we talking about here, Savannah? Because I've said a lot of things over 50 years, and I'm guessing you've got something particular in mind." Savannah didn't flinch. She'd done her homework, and she wasn't backing down. In a 1984 interview, you talked about how film sets were more fun back then because everyone knew how to take a joke. And you specifically mentioned that actresses were less sensitive about certain types of humor. You said, and I'm quoting here, "Everyone understood it was all in good fun. Nobody was running to their lawyer every time someone paid them a compliment." Do you think that perspective holds up today? Jack's smile turned into something colder. "You know what I think, Savannah? I think we live in a time where everyone's so eager to be offended on someone else's behalf that we've forgotten what actual human interaction looks like. Yeah, I said film sets were more fun. They were. People laughed. People didn't walk around with a list of words you couldn't say and topics you couldn't mention. We made art, we told stories, and we didn't spend half our day worried about whether someone's feelings might get hurt, because life isn't a padded room." The audience got quiet. This wasn't the charming Jack Nicholson they'd expected. This was the other side, the one that didn't care about playing nice for the cameras. Savannah pressed forward. "But Jack, don't you think there's a difference between being sensitive and simply treating people with respect? A lot of the actresses who worked in that era have come forward to say that what you call jokes were actually harassment, that the culture you're describing wasn't fun for everyone, especially not for the women who had to tolerate it to keep their careers." Jack leaned forward now, taking off his sunglasses for the first time. His eyes were sharp, focused, annoyed. "Let me tell you something about respect, Savannah. Respect isn't about walking on eggshells. Respect is about treating people like adults who can handle themselves. The women I worked with, the real professionals, they gave as good as they got. They were tough. They were talented. They didn't need someone like you deciding decades later that they were victims who couldn't speak up for themselves. You want to talk about respect? How about respecting them enough to believe they had agency, that they made their own choices, that they weren't just helpless little flowers waiting to be rescued by modern sensibilities? Savannah's jaw tightened. I'm not suggesting they were helpless, Jack. I'm suggesting that the power dynamics on those sets made it difficult for women to speak up without risking their careers, and that maybe, just maybe, some of the behavior that was normalized back then wasn't actually okay. Can you acknowledge that? Jack laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. Power dynamics. That's the phrase everyone loves now, isn't it? Let me tell you about power dynamics. I was a struggling actor once too. I took roles I didn't want. I worked with directors who treated me like garbage. I put up with stuff because that's what you do when you're trying to make it. That's not a gender thing. That's a life thing. Everyone pays their dues. The difference is, I didn't spend the next 40 years complaining about it. I got better, I got stronger, I got successful, and I moved on. One of the other hosts tried to interject, tried to lighten the mood, but Savannah wasn't done. But Jack, you were never in a position where your gender made you vulnerable to a specific type of harassment. You were never asked to tolerate inappropriate behavior because saying no might mean you'd never work again. That's the difference we're talking about here. Jack's voice dropped lower, more dangerous. You know what I'm tired of, Savannah? I'm tired of being lectured by people who weren't there, who didn't live through it, who want to judge everything through the lens of today's standards. You want to talk about my career? Let's talk about how I got here. Talent, hard work, taking risks, making choices, not sitting around waiting for someone to hand me a safe space. You think the women I admire, the real icons, you think they got where they are by being fragile, by needing protection from every hard conversation? Savannah shot back immediately, her voice rising slightly. No one's saying women are fragile, Jack. We're saying that calling out bad behavior isn't weakness, it's courage. And dismissing those concerns as oversensitivity, that's exactly the kind of attitude that allowed that behavior to continue for so long. Jack stood up from his chair, not in a rush, but with deliberate slowness that made everyone in the studio freeze. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't making a scene in the traditional sense, but his body language screamed that he was done playing along. You know what, Savannah? I came here thinking this was going to be a conversation. Turns out it's an ambush, dressed up as an interview. You had your angle before I even walked through that door. Savannah remained seated, her composure intact, but her eyes were flashing with determination. It's not an ambush to ask you to reflect on your own words, Jack. You said those things publicly. They're on record. I'm simply asking if you still believe them, or if you've reconsidered. Given everything we've learned about how toxic those environments were for so many people, Jack pointed at her, his finger jabbing the air between them. Toxic. There's another one of your buzzwords. Everything's toxic now. Every joke is harassment. Every compliment is predatory. Every tough director is abusive. You want to know what's actually toxic? This culture of constant judgment, where nobody's allowed to have made a mistake, where nobody's allowed to have lived in a different time with different standards, where everyone has to grovel and apologize for not having been born with 2024 values. Already programmed into their brain, one of the other hosts, trying desperately to salvage the situation, jumped in with a nervous laugh. Jack, I think what Savannah is trying to say is that we can appreciate your work while also acknowledging that some things about the industry needed to change. Nobody's attacking you personally. Jack turned his gaze to her, and she immediately regretted speaking. Really? Because it sure feels personal when someone drags up a quote from 40 years ago and uses it to paint me as some kind of villain. I've spent my entire life making films that mean something, that challenge people, that make them think and feel. And now I'm supposed to apologize because I remember when people had thicker skin and didn't treat every interaction like a potential lawsuit. Savannah wasn't backing down. If anything, Jack's reaction was only strengthening her resolve. Jack, with all due respect, having thick skin shouldn't mean tolerating harassment. And I think you know the difference. I think you're smart enough to understand that what you're calling jokes and camaraderie, other people experienced as intimidation and abuse. The question isn't whether you intended harm. The question is whether you're willing to listen to the people who were harmed and take responsibility for your part in that culture. Jack's laugh was bitter now, sharp and cutting. Take responsibility. You want me to take responsibility for an entire era? For the way an entire industry operated? I was one actor, Savannah. One person trying to do good work. I didn't create Hollywood. I didn't write the rules. I showed up, I did my job, I treated people the way they treated me, with honesty and directness. If that's not good enough for you, if you need me to perform some kind of public repentance for having lived through the 70s and 80s without being psychic enough to know what the standards would be in 40 years, then I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you. Savannah leaned forward, her voice steady and clear. I'm not asking you to be psychic, Jack. I'm asking you to have empathy. I'm asking you to consider that your experience of those film sets might have been very different from the experience of the women around you, and that their perspective is just as valid as yours. That's all. Just basic human empathy. Jack shook his head slowly, a gesture of complete dismissal. You want to talk about empathy? How about having some empathy for the fact that I'm a human being who's lived a complex life, who's made thousands of decisions, who's worked with hundreds of people, and who doesn't fit neatly into your narrative of oppressor and victim? How about having empathy for the idea that maybe, just maybe, things were more nuanced than you're making them out to be? Savannah's response came without hesitation. Things can be nuanced and still be wrong, Jack. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive. Yes, you're a complex person who's done incredible work. That doesn't mean every choice you made was right. That doesn't mean you get a pass on behavior that hurt people just because it was common at the time. That's not how growth works. That's not how accountability works. Jack's voice dropped to almost a whisper, which somehow made it more menacing than if he'd been shouting. You know what your problem is, Savannah? You think you have all the answers. You think your generation figured it all out? That you're the enlightened ones who finally understand how people should behave, how they should think, how they should talk. And anyone who doesn't fall in line with your worldview, anyone who dares to suggest that maybe things aren't as black and white as you want them to be, they're the problem. They're the dinosaur. They're the one who needs to be educated. Savannah matched his intensity, her voice calm but forceful. No, Jack. What I think is that we should always be questioning ourselves, always be willing to learn, always be open to the possibility that we got something wrong. And what I'm seeing right now is someone who's so invested in defending his past that he can't even entertain the possibility that some of his attitudes might have contributed to an environment that made people uncomfortable. That's not about generation gaps. That's about willingness to grow. The audience was completely silent now. This had gone so far beyond a typical daytime talk show moment that nobody knew how to react. Some people looked uncomfortable, others looked riveted. A few looked like they wanted to leave, but couldn't tear their eyes away from the confrontation unfolding in front of them. Jack picked up his sunglasses from the table and put them back on, a gesture that felt like armor going back up. You want growth? Here's some growth for you. I've grown enough to know when I'm in a conversation that's not going anywhere. I've grown enough to recognize when someone's more interested in scoring points than actually understanding another person's perspective. And I've grown enough to know when it's time to walk away from something that's wasting my time. Savannah stood up now too, facing him across the table. So that's it. When the conversation gets difficult, you just leave. When someone challenges you to think about your impact on other people, you shut down. For someone who talks so much about people being too sensitive, you're showing pretty thin skin right now, Jack. That hit a nerve. Jack's jaw clenched, and for a moment it looked like he might actually lose his composure completely. Thin skin. You think this is about my feelings being hurt? This is about dignity, Savannah. This is about refusing to participate in a public shaming disguised as dialogue. You didn't bring me here to have a conversation. You brought me here to make an example of me, to show your audience how enlightened you are by comparison. Well, congratulations. You've made your point. Jack Nicholson, Hollywood dinosaur, refuses to bend the knee to modern orthodoxy. I'm sure that'll play great for you. Savannah's voice rose now, frustration finally breaking through her professional veneer. This isn't about me, Jack. This isn't about making myself look good. This is about using whatever platform I have to push back against attitudes that have caused real harm to real people. If that makes you uncomfortable, if that feels like an attack, maybe that's something worth examining instead of deflecting. Jack was already moving toward the edge of the stage now, done with the conversation whether Savannah was or not. You know what I'm going to examine, Savannah? Why I agreed to come on a show where the hosts are more interested in prosecuting the past than having an honest exchange. You want to change the world? Great, do it. But don't expect me to be your prop, your cautionary tale, your example of everything that was wrong with the old days. I lived through those days. I worked my ass off. I earned everything I got. And I'm not going to stand here and let you reduce all of that to some simplistic story about power and victimhood. Savannah called after him, her voice sharp. Nobody's reducing your career, Jack. We're just asking you to take responsibility for your role in a larger system. Why is that so threatening to you? Jack stopped at the edge of the stage and turned back one more time. His face was a mixture of anger and something else, something that might have been disappointment or exhaustion or both. You really want to know why it's threatening, Savannah? Because what you're doing isn't about justice or accountability or any of those noble words you keep throwing around. What you're doing is erasing context, erasing complexity, erasing the actual lived experiences of the people who were there, in favor of a neat little narrative where everyone fits into a category, good or bad, enlightened or problematic, ally or enemy. That's not reality. That's religion. And I stopped going to church a long time ago. Savannah moved around the table now, closing some of the distance between them, refusing to let him have the last word and walk away clean. Context doesn't excuse harm, Jack. Complexity doesn't mean we can't make moral judgments. And the fact that you're framing basic accountability as some kind of authoritarian thought control says more about your defensiveness than it does about what I'm actually asking you to consider. All I asked was whether you stand by comments that dismiss concerns about harassment. That's it. That's the question. Everything else, all this talk about religion and orthodoxy and public shaming, that's you building a wall so you don't have to actually engage with the question. Jack's voice went quiet again, that dangerous quiet that had marked the most intense moments of their exchange. I engage with real questions, Savannah. I don't engage with traps. And that's what your question was. If I say yes, I stand by those comments, then I'm the monster you want me to be. If I say no, I don't stand by them, then I'm admitting guilt for something I don't feel guilty about. And you get your confession, your moment of forcing the old guard to submit. Either way, you win and I lose. So forgive me for not playing your game. Savannah shook her head, genuine frustration evident now. It's not a game, Jack, and it's not a trap. It's an opportunity to show that you've listened, that you've learned, that you care about something beyond defending your own legacy. The fact that you see it as a win or lose situation, the fact that you think acknowledging growth is the same as submission, that tells me everything I need to know about why these conversations are so difficult. Jack laughed again, that same bitter sound. You want to know what I've learned, Savannah? I've learned that no matter what I say, no matter how I say it, there's a whole generation of people who have already decided who I am, based on cherry-picked quotes and modern interpretations of old interviews. I've learned that nuance is dead, that forgiveness is conditional on complete capitulation, and that the court of public opinion doesn't care about context or intent or the actual complexity of human relationships. I've learned that people would rather feel righteous than be fair. One of the other hosts made another attempt to intercede, her voice pleading now. Jack, please, let's just take a breath here. Nobody's trying to attack you. We're all just trying to have an important conversation about how the industry has changed and where we go from here. Can we at least agree that the goal is making things better for everyone? Jack turned his attention to her, and his voice softened slightly, though the edge never fully disappeared. Making things better, sure, great goal. But better, according to whose standards? Better for whom? You say you want to make things better for everyone, but what you're actually doing is making things better for people who think like you, who talk like you, who see the world through your particular lens. Everyone else, everyone who doesn't use the right words or express the right opinions or perform the right rituals of contrition. They get left behind. They get labeled, they get dismissed, and you call that progress. Savannah cut back in, not willing to let the moment slip away. Jack, nobody's asking you to use specific words or perform rituals. We're asking you to care about the experiences of people who were hurt, to care enough to at least consider that your perspective isn't the only valid one. That's it. That's literally all we're asking. And the fact that you're treating that like some kind of oppression is honestly baffling to me. Jack's response was immediate, his voice rising again. You know what's baffling to me, Savannah? That you think you know what I care about. That you think because I won't give you the performance you want, the apology you're fishing for, that means I don't care about people. I've spent my entire career telling human stories. Real stories. Stories about flawed people trying to navigate a complicated world. I've worked with thousands of people. I've lifted up young actors. I've fought for projects that mattered. I've used whatever influence I have to make films that challenge people to think. But none of that matters to you, because I won't say the magic words that make you feel validated. Savannah's voice was steel now, cutting through his protestations. The magic words? You mean like, I'm sorry? Like I understand now that some of my attitudes contributed to a harmful culture. Those magic words, because yes, Jack, sometimes an apology is what's needed. Sometimes acknowledging that you got something wrong is exactly the right thing to do, and the fact that you see that as beneath you, as some kind of performance, rather than genuine accountability, that's the problem. That's exactly the problem. Jack walked back toward the table now, not to sit down, but to make his final point face to face. You want an apology? Fine. I'm sorry that you live in a world where everything has to be categorized and judged and reduced to simple moral lessons. I'm sorry that you can't accept that people are complicated, that situations are nuanced, that history is messier than your neat narratives. I'm sorry that you need me to be your villain so badly that you're willing to twist everything I say to fit that role. There's your apology. I hope it makes you feel better. The sarcasm was thick, biting, deliberately provocative. Savannah's face flushed, her composure finally cracking just slightly. You're not sorry about anything, Jack. You're angry that someone called you out. You're angry that you can't just rely on your reputation and your legacy to shield you from criticism. And instead of doing the hard work of self-reflection, you're lashing out, you're deflecting, you're playing the victim. For someone who talks about other people being too sensitive, you're the most sensitive person in this room right now. Jack's eyes went cold. I'm done here. I'm done with this conversation, I'm done with this ambush, and I'm done pretending that what you're doing is journalism. This is theater. Bad theater. And I'm not interested in playing my part anymore. He started walking toward the exit again, his movements decisive now, final. Savannah called after him one last time, her voice carrying across the studio. Jack, walking away doesn't make you right. It just makes you unwilling to engage. And that's on you, not me. Jack didn't turn around this time. He just raised one hand in a dismissive wave and kept walking. Put it in your next headline, Savannah. Jack Nicholson walks off set because he couldn't handle the truth. I'm sure that's how you'll spin it anyway. Just make sure you mention that I've been handling the truth for 50 years while you've been reading it off cue cards. And with that, he was gone. He pushed through the studio doors and disappeared, leaving Savannah standing there. The other hosts, frozen in shock, and an audience that didn't know whether to applaud or stay silent. The cameras kept rolling because nobody had thought to cut them. This wasn't how these things were supposed to go. This wasn't the script. But it was real, raw, and it was over. Savannah took a breath, composed herself, and turned back to the camera. Well, that was certainly something. I think it's clear that we still have a lot of work to do in terms of having these conversations in a productive way. But the conversations need to happen, whether they're comfortable or not. We'll be right back after this break. The moment the cameras cut, the studio erupted into chaos, producers rushing around, the other hosts looking at each other in disbelief. And somewhere outside, Jack Nicholson was probably already in his car. Sunglasses still on, not looking back. So what do you think? Was Savannah right to push Jack on his past comments, or did she cross the line? Was Jack justified in walking off, or should he have stayed and engaged? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button, and let me know whose side you're on in this explosive confrontation. This is the kind of moment that defines where we are as a culture. So I want to hear from you. Comment right now